language documentation projects. So if we remember in the late 90s, early 2000, when we were trained in our master's courses to do language documentation, we were normally, our idea of social linguistic documentation was, I would say, or our understanding at that age in our 20s was often restricted to collecting personal information about people and a few statistics. But however, over the years, what I have learned and also learned to appreciate through my experience is that to gain an understanding and a systematic understanding of the context of language use and the choices that every community makes. And while we work in India with indigenous communities where these languages are minority languages, what we realize is people are generally multilingual. We rarely work with monolingual speakers. So for us to understand where their language stands vis-a-vis other languages around them, and what are their aspirations with respect to their language, also gives us a better understanding and a very different understanding from the structural lexicogrammatical codes that we encode and write about. I know that it is a motivation, especially when we start doing research as PhD students, because in India it's very difficult to just pass off. This is based on social linguistic research. It is not often encouraged, I would say. It's not totally actively discouraged, but not often encouraged. However, to have at least one chapter in your PhD thesis, or every time we do a research project, for us to accommodate information about the community's use of language with respect to very important domains like language change, what are the languages they have come in contact with that have induced these changes. So what is the multilingual scenario in which this language has to survive? And if we are talking about a dialectal situation where there are mutually intelligible varieties around, similar to the situation I face with the Jenu Kurubas, where very often, and I being an speaker of the standard variety of Kannada, which is spoken in Mysore, um, I realized that if I pay closer attention, I can follow most of the things that are being said in Kuruba. Not as I am interacting with the community, but as I listen to the recordings, I understand how there is a systematic variation. So that allows me to understand the differences between the various varieties, and it adds to the richness of the ethnographic information that I managed to compile about the group. I felt the same with the Malto speaking Padia community in Jharkhand, but then I wouldn't consider myself proficient in the various speech varieties of the local area. But with the Jainu Kurubas area, have a better understanding of these situations. So by collecting a much more reliable data where we pay more attention to the context of use of the language and how the speaker identities are shaped through their use of the language, will also give a richness to our corpus of whatever. So as we create metadata for our data, we know where to situate a particular speaker. Like I said, they are not just that this particular speaker multilingual in 3 or 4 other languages, but also the fact that how and where they use these different languages in their everyday life. Uh, and by illustrating the range of a speaker's linguistic competencies rather than just representing these people as monolingual speakers. That is how it often comes through in our documentation and description, actually gives a better explanation to their linguistic repertoire, and it then creates a good or a more effective, I would say, input to the various applied goals for language planning. As I was looking at material available on the Jaina Kuruba language, I came across a class 9 Kannada textbook, a text in a class 9 Kannada textbook about the Jaina Kuruba life. Now, the entire story is very much like people have given me anecdotal information about their life. However, the language in which it was presented was standard Kannada. So, the next time I talk to someone in Karnataka who is part of this textbook committee, my recommendation to them or my suggestion to them would be to bring in a few elements of the Jaina Kuruba language. I think the intention of actually bringing in this text into the Kannada textbook must have been to introduce the community and the richness of the society in Karnataka by introducing the linguistic dimension in its very wholesome context of the story of the people in their own language. Would have been extremely effective, I would say. Um, with that, I would also not just limit myself talking about Jain Kurubas, but I would also talk before I go on to elaborate on the Jain Kurubas, also draw your attention on various other works that have happened in India. One very important work that has happened in the last 8 to 9 years is the work by Dr. Sonal Joshi Kulkarni on the Bheels and the Pauras. In 2013, there is a publication in Indian linguistics co-authored with Professor Mohanty and Professor Hasnain, where they talk about the Bhili and the language of the Pauras having a Munda substratum. But for me, what drew my attention as somebody working on language documentation and its impact was Dr. Kulkarni's work, and I have observed her talking about it, where she reports some linguistic data and some ethnographic observations in terms of how displacement and migration has affected the use of language. And because this is a different kind of displacement, this is a river valley project, and the people are displaced from place which was going to be submerged by the dam from a dam construction type to another place. So they were resettled in Revanagar and Narmada Nagar, which was the plains, and they were originally from a hilly region. So this is very similar to what I have observed in my own experience of research, where people are again moved away from their natural habitat. In my case, it usually used to be forests. That people have have fewer things to talk about, because with the loss of habitat, what they also lose out is a familiar lifestyle. And they realize that the newer habitat and the newer lifestyle has different terms of livelihood, and these terms of livelihood have to be negotiated through the languages that they come in contact with in their newer habitat, and they are somehow convinced that they have to concede some space in their own linguistic repertoire to be able to negotiate in this newer space. And I just want to reiterate one more time that this somehow makes people have not such a positive attitude toward their language. And where they were, I suppose, once a monolingual community, and if not a monolingual community, mostly had most domains in their life which involved their native language. Now they see that their language is very often restricted to their intra-group communication. And if they travel to places as migrant labor, which happens very often in search of economic gains, then there's not even an intra-group communication, but they are restricted to only a set of few families and just a few relatives communicating in their language. And it's usually a reminiscent kind of topics that they are talking about. So the language attitudes that people have are very often evaluative reactions to the different languages or language varieties around them. So very often people do not just perceive differences in the various varieties, but they also put it on an hierarchical scale of either utility of how they can earn through one language, earn more through one language, and how it is useful in a larger group communication, in a wider group communication, as uh, some other language, as against their own language, they would have preferences in terms of the utility of another language. However, we do not discount the solidarity attributions that they have and the in-group loyalty they have. That will, of course, be retained in spirit. But in practice, again, because they have to talk about issues that pertain to their life and activities that are not just in group, like reporting things that happened in school. The children come back and start repeating things that were said in school when they report things that happened in school. And if they are working in if they have occupations where they have people as employers who are not using the same language as their in-group language, then again, most of their discussions end up being in another language. So people in practice start code mixing to begin with, and then eventually become bilingual. And the worst case scenario is when when in a couple of generations they start shifting to another language. However, the choice is always for the community to make in terms of irrespective of their status, demographic and institutional support, whether they want to maintain the in-group solidarity, which many communities that I have come across, and especially when you ask a survey kind of a question or ask them a direct question as an outsider, are you interested in maintaining your native language? It comes in the affirmative. That is true. But in practice, the way I point out on the last line here, in terms of their socialization, especially in their early life socialization, which I would say used to start from school, but these days the entire Anganwadi service, if we can call that, the Anganwadi service has started pre-primary level care for children. In addition, most of these Anganwadi workers, because it needs to be, to even to be a Anganwadi employee, needs a certain qualification are not in-group members, but people who come from outside. They are part of the dominant linguistic community and not the indigenous communities. The children are exposed to certain linguistic attitudes at a very early age. The attitudes are in terms of simple cultural practices like starting a prayer at the beginning of the day will not be something that would have been the way they would have normally started their day in their practices in their community, but it would be a standard uh, prayer, usually in a dominant variety, and there is a prestige value attributed to it. So it begins from there, and there is a constant correction, especially in mutually intelligible speech varieties. There is an attitude ingrained in school going and preschool children of correcting them towards a dominant variety and making them re-evaluate their starting with their pronunciation and the use of lexical items. They start becoming very evaluative and very diffident in terms of what they have to use in what context, and start making value judgments to that effect. So in the life of a language like Jainakuruba, the attitudes that appear towards restoration, preservation, decay, and death. People are a little alarmed these days at in terms of the rate at which the children are code mixing and very often using the dominant varieties. So Baker suggests that whenever we design a survey of language attitudes to study all the things that I've talked about in the last 10-15 minutes, what we need to ask, what kind of questions we need to ask, has to provide an indicator of the thoughts and beliefs and preferences and also the desires, right? It is of course most of the surveys are often self-reporting, and it might not be the holistic picture of a community's linguistic profile, but it does encompass um, their perspective on their own language. And since attitude as such is an hypothetical construct, and we use this construct to explain the behavior or the persistence of a certain behavior or shift in behavior or the direction of shift in behavior. Uh, so we may not be able to remark upon a stable and an enduring disposition uh, all the time, but however, that is the whole idea of documentation, right? That we do it periodically, so that if there is either a maintenance or a shift, then we are able to document it from time to time. So our attitude, which is often as speakers and as linguists both, it's based on our observations of the use by speakers, and this often influences our judgment, especially as speakers. When we observe the community around us is no longer using a certain expression that only I am using, we tend to be very conscious of it. And this in turn probably also constructs a social status. If the language is a high prestige language like say Sanskrit in our society. Anybody being able to say anything in Sanskrit would be deemed as high social status. However, if somebody moves from a rural area to a urban area and wants to retain his native variety, then this may be deemed as something that is of low social status, and then the person may want to shift to the dominant variety to become part of the larger urban group. So this is often accounted in terms of dialect leveling, but apart from that, there is a conscious suppression of linguistic choices that a speaker makes based on the environment they are in and their perception of how their language would be received. So based on these attitudes, various linguistic and cultural stereotypes are constructed and also often reinforced um, by I have seen people from Jenukuruba communities submitting letters to government offices. Like very often they do it at social welfare departments run by Karnataka state government, and the officer sitting there will say, "You guys don't even know how to write a letter. Uh, you don't know how to make an application, and you need to get it checked by the school teacher. Did you write it right now?" So a simple act of applying for something is also a test in their linguistic competence, and people are very often given to believe that their inability of being able to use language in a certain way also reflects on their poverty, right? Why? Because the access to benefits is through a majority language or a dominant language, and this hence kind of brings in a negative attitude, or if not negative attitude, very often a diffidence that their language has to be restricted only to their intergroup communication. So now I have mentioned enough about the theoretical background on attitudes. I will go into the particular case of Jainakurubas. So this is a community who are the original residents of the forests in the Western Ghats, and also in some parts of uh, the plains around the forest region. In Kannada, the word Jenu means honey, and Kuruba is a word which is a caste name and is associated with a much larger group of non-agricultural uh, groups, including forest dwellers and also nomadic populations. Uh, so the name, as it suggests, these people were identified as honey gatherers because one of the commodities they traded with the world outside the jungles that they lived in was honey. Um, uh, for as long as they have written in the language, they have written in the Kannada script, simply because every time they went to school in Karnataka, these people are mostly residing in the three districts of South Karnataka, which is Chamarajnagar, Mysore, and Coorg. Um, and they have always been educated in the dominant language Kannada. They were counted only once, they were distinctly counted as a population of 34,747 in the 81 census. A rough estimate that the intra-community group makes as of today is anywhere between 40 to 50,000. So a very conservative estimate based on 10% population increase would be somewhere like 40 to 45,000. They make this estimate based on their estimation of electoral politics. Neither the 1981 syllabus is a survey of the linguistic return for the census, nor is this number of 40,000 a result of any survey of linguistic competence. It's only because of the ethnic identity of the group. So this is the region here, which is the region of, so here this big green chunk is, I'm sorry, this is not the best map I should have put here. This is the Bandipur Tiger Reserve area, and this is Nagarhole, which is also part of the Rajiv Gandhi National Park. This entire area was where this green jungle area was where the Chenukurubas used to live until the early 1970s. However, they were displaced, and in the 70s a larger group of people were displaced. I think about 10 to 15% of the community is still left in the forest. The rest of them have been rehabilitated. Mostly we have Hegade Devan Kote here, one pocket on around here, some pockets around here, and another pocket on this side. So there are three main settlements, and once they moved out of the forest, they have come increasingly in contact with a diverse linguistic group. So why do we say that? The first thing, they are not the only ethnic groups that are dislocated from the forest. The Kadukurubas and the Soligas were also, I think, on this side right here, which is the Coorg district. Even the Yaravas have been dislocated from the forest region. But what was interesting is that these communities say that communication with other ethnic groups did not happen very often while they were in the forest. And even now it does not happen, except that there are a few political dimensions to their communication with these groups. One is because of their social stature and the fact that they are all displaced groups and interact as laborers when they work in the fields of the local landlords, or in any of the projects like the Narega projects. That's when they interact. And they are also, and more importantly, and why I am actually making this presentation, is that it has made each of their communities more and more conscious of their identity, not just for themselves, but vis-a-vis other linguistic groups as well. Uh, in terms of the fact that now it is even more important for them to maintain a distinct linguistic identity, more so for the Jainu-Kurubas, simply because they are one of the two groups which are identified as the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. There are only two in Karnataka. One is the Koraga in coastal Karnataka, and Jainakurubas are the only other group. So because of this recognition, are supposed to receive additional benefits in terms of social welfare schemes. However, their very recent fear has been that the other ethnic groups, the other displaced tribal groups, are impersonating as Jainakurubas to make these claims. And their claim is that the only way of establishing your identity right now is through paperwork. And while I talk to them, I realize that there are other ways of establishing identity, and they have increasingly become aware that easiest and the quickest way of establishing the Jenukuruba identity is their unique speech variety. And that has been a motivation for this group to make a conscious effort towards language maintenance and retaining their identity through their language. So retaining their identity not so much through their food and clothes and other kind of cultural practices, but basically through their language, because they have time and again challenged in many of my interviews that I bet that no other ethnic group around me, be it the Yeravas or be it the Soligas or be it the Betakurubas, these people do not speak like me, so they will not be able to establish themselves as a Jenukuruba and claim the benefit. But right now, they feel a little cheated that this is not the case, and anybody who manages to produce a certificate walks away with the benefits. So, with this in mind, I had designed a survey questionnaire to address the issues faced by the Jaina Kurba community. The questionnaire, like you see, was in Kannada, so I'm not sure if many people or anybody who are attending the talk right now can read anything, but I just use it as my reference on this slide. So I asked them about their educational status, which was very interesting, that although they did claim that there are people who have completed their school, at least matriculation class 10, I hardly found in my survey of at least 3 different villages, I hardly found about 10 people who have finished school. They're usually school dropouts. And one of their complaints is that the entire formal education system is totally unfamiliar in terms of a lifestyle to be restricted to a classroom 9 to 4 or 9 to 3, whatever it is. And that is one of the reasons the children are not interested to be in school. Another reason being that the language and the topics being discussed as part of school curriculum are not at all interesting, and to make a long tenure commitment to it is not attractive for their children. What I also observed in my own observation is that since these people in the past have been familiar with the forest, although they were displaced, they always found employment with the forest department at the lowest possible entry levels. And since there was an assured employment, and because they were rehabilitated populations, they also got a lot of benefits. There was no real motivation for a job oriented academic qualification. And of course, in most of these surveys, they always say that it's only because the curriculum is not in their native language, they cannot relate to the material there. That is, of course, their main complaint. But I also see that there is very little motivation for someone to have a sustained academic practice. In addition to surveys, I also conducted several interviews and also became an observer. It often started off as interviewing one or two people in the presence of a few other members of the community, but it often ended up being a group discussion, and a intra-group discussion. This is one such interview. We started off with this person here, Mr. Kalappa in Metikuppe village, Metikuppe colony in Mysore district. This was 2 years ago in May 2018. But there were about 15 people in this group here, and at least 10 of them ended up sharing their views about their language, and some of it I am about. So with the Jaina Kurubas, their attitudes very often also reflect their social categorization, especially in the post 70s, I would say. And they now identify themselves with the various other scheduled tribe groups around them, and they are also repentant of their changed social status, because they often say that when I was in my home in the jungle, I was the king. I was my own master, and we may not measure up to the economic standards of urban or rural life, but we were much more well off and well to do while we were in the jungle. And to this day, the people who were actually dislocated from the forest often are living in the hope that they may get relocated back into the forest. And most of these people report that they are completely proficient in the native language Jainanudi. But those children who are born post 1980, I would say, are are the younger generation, where they do of course say that we use the language Jainanudi, but they are not forthcoming in their speech as against the adults in the community. And my analysis has been that their identity was an amalgamation of their indigenous knowledge and their linguistic competence, right? So when they do not have many topics to talk about their life, their food, what they ate has what they used to eat in the jungle is quite different from what they eat right now, because most of the food they eat comes from the public distribution scheme, the ration they get from the government agencies. So for a city dweller, they look like people who are literally living on dole and still unhappy about it. But many of you who work with indigenous communities probably empathize with this situation, where they have taken me to the social forests around them and said that whenever they get rare opportunities to go into the jungle to not regularly but very rarely go into the jungle, sometimes for their religious practices, sometimes for some of their rituals, to some of their sports. Like one of the things that the Jaina Kurubas are allowed to do is to visit their burial grounds. So in these instances, they say that they bring back a few plants and grow it in their new neighborhood, but they say it's not the same. We were foragers who used to live on things in the bounty of the jungle. They're looking for things that grew naturally in the depth of the forest, and now they're turned into agriculturists. And not that they did not do any cultivation at all. They did it for a few things, for not all of the things that were part of their diet or their of the food they consumed. And especially their indigenous knowledge in terms of the medicinal value of various plants. They again say that they are able to bring back some plants and replant it in the social forest around them. So the difference between the social forest and the dense jungle is that there is about a 1 or 2 kilometer stretch on the outskirts of the deep jungle, which is demarcated as social forest. And these people have access to that part of the wooded area, which is sparsely there is not no real wildlife there, and it is even in terms of tree density, it is much sparse as against the deeper jungles. So they have of course replicated this, but they have realized since 1970 to now is near almost 50 years. For some people, it's not the only one place that they were rehabilitated. They've been rehabilitated in different villages in the last 50 years. So they have shifted villages as well, some groups. So because of this, they realize that they are unable to pass on the indigenous knowledge systems they had, and hence they also see a diminished opportunity of passing on their linguistic knowledge. uh, so this is exactly the kind of thing Garrett talks about in terms of linguistic attitude, that linguistic attitude is acquired one from personal experiences and the social environment. So if their social ecology has completely changed, then their attitude also gets affected. And there are several personal experiences in the sense, as forest dwellers, they not that they were not aware of their dominant language or they did not come out of the forest, they did, but rarely so. But however, now it is since they are not in the jungle at all and they live in villages on the uh, so even in the rural areas, they never live in the towns. They live these people live in separate colonies which are specially constructed because the government constructs houses for them. So there are specific colonies on the outskirts of villages, and they're usually farm laborers and domestic helps in the villages. So they are forced to become code switch or often become bilingual. So one of my survey questions was, who else is familiar with your language? So they said that nobody in this area in Mysore district, but in the Coorg district, there are other indigenous communities who we used to communicate with. They have moved on to the other side and have settlements there. And they live in those parts and they are familiar and sometimes use a few phrases here and there from our language, but otherwise it is definitely the Jainakuruba identity is an intragroup identity. However, these days most Jainakurubas are often code switching even in their intragroup communication, because every time they have to talk about various issues there that affect their personal life, like being persecuted. They're very often persecuted for entering the jungle illegally. So their claim, of course, is that they always have some immediate requirement and they cannot be bothered to go through paperwork, but they are always caught by the forest guards and put in jail for that. And there is so one part of their socialization and everyday life is to give give some bail, get some bail or give some surety, and get someone back, deal with the police and the forest guards on a daily basis. And these are people who speak the dominant language. It needs a lot of written communication to happen. Hence, um, many of their everyday practices. So the places that an adult male goes to and anybody who writes goes to is usually either the social welfare office, the forest office, or the police station. In each of these places, they definitely need to be bilingual. And the other place that people go to is schools. And in these places, they are all very often, because it's a mutually intelligible variety, the school teacher is constantly correcting a child in terms of his or her usage of the language, which reinforces an attitude in the child that they are somewhere being held back in mastering the dominant language of the region by using their native language, Jainanudi, which also informed me when they explained these things to me, the school children. What it informed me is that even today they do make a distinction between the two languages. However, the scope of being able to use that language, they say, is only during the break time, or if they have a cultural event where they are specifically asked to perform. Usually it's a song dance kind of a thing where they're allowed or encouraged to use Jainanudi, but not to stand up in class and explain a concept in comfortably in whatever language that comes to them naturally. They said no, there we really need to make a conscious effort to use the dominant language. And then by the time they reach high school, and the other reason why most of them drop out of high school is the English language, which is totally seems to be inaccessible to them, because it is not familiar to them at all, and it hits them out of the blue suddenly. And most people who fail are have often failed in the English language, so much so that those people who have managed to cross that big hurdle of going past the school system and entering college become college dropouts, because they are intimidated by the quantum of curriculum that is introduced to them in the English language. Until then, they deal with English in terms of one of the subjects in school, but higher education exposes them to the English language. So they have another language to contend with, where when they have to renegotiate their place in a world and try to vie for economic opportunities. And they think that these two hurdles, the dominant language and the English language, are the two main linguistic hurdles in the way of their economic prosperity. So in terms of the overt attitude expressed by the community, they wish for an orthography. They say that people should compile and translate, and they should encourage us, they should give us awards and recognitions for written literature. Our language and our culture should be represented in television and radio programs. They've often claimed that they are not well to do and have no access through smartphones to web content. But if you run a quick search on Jainakuruba on YouTube, it will show a decent list of content, usually recordings of songs, but a whole lot of other content as well. So this language does have a presence on the web, but however, this is usually uploaded by researchers like you and me, or some recording company which has recorded songs of various indigenous communities and put it up on YouTube. And the Jainakuruba community as such is not aware of the existence of web content, and as of now it is beyond their imagination in terms of requiring to have a web presence at all. They haven't reached there, but they're very happy if they appear on radio and television. However, in terms of the community's covert attitude, although they are desirous of various opportunities and representations, their expectation is that somebody else will work, some external force will work for them, and they will somehow magically get jobs of school teachers and Anganwadi workers without getting a school level qualification. That is their desire, that they should get the jobs, and otherwise without these government supported economic initiatives, they do not at all show any motivation to preserve any material. They always say that somebody like you came a few years ago, somebody from an NGO staged a play in our language, and some people from our community went to the nearest biggest city, Mysore, and performed the play in the most popular cultural centers. It's extremely prestigious all over Karnataka, the stage of Rangayana in Mysore, but they do not have a copy of the script. So they are not at all motivated to preserve any material created by external agencies in their language, which then kind of brings several questions like the ones I have here. So I have listed all the questions that I had, and this is probably what I would like to take up in my discussion with you as well. So I start off with where I started off the discussion at the beginning of my talk. So what is the effect of displacement and also the redistribution of community? Because within the forest, they said that they knew how to reach each other, but now they find it extremely expensive to travel around the forest in the plain areas to have to look upon themselves as a cohesive community. Right now they think like they have been distributed and separated, and to come together as a community has become one of their newer challenges. And the whole idea that their children have to go through a compulsory education program in a dominant language of the region, and that is for them an extremely stressful lifestyle and a new lifestyle. It's a total shift in lifestyle, uh, and they claim that that affects their linguistics sustainability. In many of the questionnaires, the questions that people responded to in terms of how are their efforts of passing on their language to the younger generation working, people have often reported that our children are, we often catch them code mixing, and they are not fluent in our native language. So this has also or affected their social patterns in terms of intra-generational perceptions on the language, and they can say they perceive that there will be attrition, and this kind of change is very often not welcome, of course, especially when we ask overt questions in terms of is it welcome or not. It doesn't seem to be welcome, although there is no active resistance to it. They think that this is inevitable, and they also think that unless they shift to the dominant language, they will not be able to afford any social alleviation. So they also see the incentive in, if not shifting, but to use the dominant language in as many domains as possible. And of course, they are desirous that their cultural heritage and their oral artifacts be preserved. As of now, there are still a lot of people who are able to talk about, narrate, sing in their language. But every time I ask the younger generation to sing, the girls in their teens, who otherwise do converse in their language, but in terms of talking about their cultural heritage or uh, talking about folk tales, they always point to the oral older generation. However, I must say that it might be just a little bit of diffidence, and I've done my fieldwork with this community only for in the last 3 years now, and that's not long enough to actually look at the depth of the cultural heritage of a community. So I do need to spend more time. um, what has happened is that I did ask them, while you lived in the jungle, did you think that one language was better than the other? They said that we had a lot of respect for the Maharaja and the people in the city, but we were not made to feel that we were the lowest rung of the society the way we are made to feel right now. So they are more aware of a hierarchical structure now rather than then, not as in they weren't, but because another thing I should mention before I finish is that because they were forest dwellers, the Jenu Kuruba community even today is considered experts in handling elephants. So they are still, even today, part of the elephant handlers in the with the not just with the forest department, but also for the various events that are included as part of, say, the Sera procession, when they have to handle the elephants, and there are a few elephants which are part of the Mysore Palace environment, so they take care of those elephants. This is also part of their another dimension of their cultural heritage and their indigenous language, and they are extremely proud that they do have this privileged position as elephant handlers, and that is one dimension which they see as part of conserving their identity, and also their linguistic identity, because they say that they communicate with the elephants in their language, and hence they say that no other community who's also forest dwellers manages to do that. uh, However, they say that their younger generation is not comfortable with the fauna, the animals that they do not grow up with. And that may also be a consequence of displacement outside the forest. So, finally, I just wanted to cite the UNESCO uh, website saying that information and knowledge are key determinants of wealth creation, social transformation, and human development. And language is a primary vector for communicating information and knowledge. And the opportunity to use one's own language in various spheres, this, of course, since I'm citing the website, through the internet will determine the extent to which one can appreciate emerging knowledge societies. So the representation of the Jainam Kuruba community and their identity is well represented through the internet, of course. But apart from that, even this is not enough of a motivation for the community to continue with the language maintenance that they have done in the last 50 years. They will need something more than that. and these are my references. So I stop here. I will stop sharing and we can have a discussion. I can take questions.
Now the paper is open to discussion. Now the paper is open to discussion. Participants, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and then pose the question.
So there is the question.
Hello? Yeah.
Can I read it? So the query is regarding the hierarchical scale utility that I talked about in the early part of my presentation. So the question is that the differences in language perceived by the native speaker are put in some hierarchy, and is there any standard scale for utilities of such studies? Not that I am aware of, but we also have Dr. Sonal Kulkarni here, who might know better than me, but I do not know of a standard scale that is especially used in terms of languages. The one that I know is Maslow's hierarchy, but that is often borrowed from social psychology. So what we are applying in linguistics is often the kind of scales that are used for attitudes in general, social attitudes in general, in sociology and psychology, but we haven't, I am not sure that we have worked out a scale in terms of the attitudes of native speakers.